The forest was alive with the crisp scent of pine and the soft rustle of leaves dancing in the breeze. It was Friday evening, just hours before the opening day of deer season, and instead of heading to the cabin with my wife, Lila, as I usually did, I found myself driving toward Sarah's house. Sarah, a close friend of Lila's, was about to embark on her first hunting trip, an idea born out of necessity rather than choice. Earlier that year, I'd experienced a minor cardiac incident, which left Lila adamant that I shouldn't spend the weekend alone in the woods. She had been selected to attend a series of educational reform meetings at the state capitol, a place we jokingly referred to as the Big House. While it was an honor for her, it felt like an inconvenience to me. Normally, I would have gone hunting alone, something I'd done countless times before, but Lila insisted on arranging company for me. Enter Sarah. Sarah was pleasant enough, younger than me, closer in age to my eldest daughter, but I didn't know her well beyond a handful of school events where our paths crossed. From what Lila had told me, Sarah's recent divorce had left her emotionally drained. Her ex-husband, a textbook narcissist, had blamed her for his own infidelity, accusing her of being inadequate in every possible way. The irony? He was the one who pursued other women during work trips, yet he twisted the narrative to paint himself as the victim. As I pulled up to Sarah's modest suburban home, I gave a quick honk of the horn, something I wouldn't normally do, but had been instructed to do this time. The front door opened almost immediately, spilling warm light onto the porch. There she stood, framed by the doorway, burdened with an impressive amount of gear. "Hey, thanks for coming," she said cheerfully, her voice bright despite the weight of her bags. I stepped out of the truck, taking on my role as her guide and teacher for the weekend. Helping her load her things into the bed of the pickup, I couldn't help but notice how animated she was. To call her talkative would be an understatement. She kept up a non-stop stream of chatter during the hour-long drive to the cabin. Words like cheerful, bubbly, and energetic came to mind as she filled the air with conversation, a stark contrast to the withdrawn and quiet individual Lila had described over the past few months. We arrived at the cabin around 9 p.m., nestled deep within 20,000 acres of Missouri forest. The property was a labor of love for Lila and me. Over the years, we'd transformed it into a haven for wildlife enthusiasts, carving out ATV trails, planting food plots, and building a cozy weekend retreat. The cabin itself was rustic yet functional, heated by a wood stove and powered by solar panels with a backup generator. Its design was efficient, with sliding doors connecting the bathroom to both the bedroom and the great room, allowing warmth to circulate freely. By 9:30 p.m., I had a fire crackling in the wood stove, casting a golden glow across the main room. Sarah wasted no time settling into the loft, organizing her gear for the morning. Meanwhile, I flipped on the satellite receiver to catch the tail end of an old war movie. "Is it okay if I use the shower?" Sarah called down from the loft. "Sure, go ahead," I replied, having already shown her the cabin's layout earlier. The bathroom's design was practical, with two large sliding doors, one leading to the bedroom and the other to the great room. I was proud of how seamlessly it blended functionality with comfort. Lost in the movie, I barely registered the sound of Sarah descending the spiral staircase near the sofa. My attention snapped to her as she passed by, wearing nothing but a small towel that barely covered her. She walked to the bathroom, the lower edges of the towel riding up slightly as she moved. Reaching the door, she juggled her soap, shampoo, and towel, nearly dropping everything before sliding the door shut behind her. For her ex to claim she wasn't attractive was absurd. I shook my head, trying to push away the image and refocus on the movie. But the sound of the shower starting brought unbidden thoughts to mind. Sarah was just on the other side of the door, and my imagination began to wander. I scolded myself, reminding me why I was here. To teach her about hunting, not entertain inappropriate thoughts. Still, her soft singing drifted through the walls, making it hard to concentrate. Eventually, the singing stopped, and I could hear only the steady hum of the water running. I wasn't worried about her running out of hot water, thanks to the instant heater, but I was surprised at how long she was taking. At least she chose to shower tonight instead of in the morning, I thought, grateful for the extra time it would give us tomorrow. When the water finally stopped, I heard her humming softly again as she dried herself off. Moments later, she emerged from the bathroom, partially wrapped in the towel, her damp hair cascading over her shoulders. She made her way toward the stairs, her sides and back exposed as she climbed upward, disappearing from sight. "You know, I really appreciate your wife inviting me out here," she said, descending the stairs again, this time dressed in tiny navy blue shorts and a cropped white top that barely covered her midriff. She stepped off the stairs and walked past me, sitting down on the sofa beside me. In her hand was what appeared to be an empty jar of peanut butter. "Yeah, tomorrow should be interesting," I replied, feeling slightly uncomfortable. The cabin was old but cozy, its wooden walls adorned with antique furniture that gave it a rustic charm. A faint scent of pine lingered in the air, mingling with the warmth radiating from the wood stove. Sarah couldn't help but admire how Daniel had transformed this remote space into something inviting. Yet, beneath the surface of coziness, an undercurrent of unease lingered, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As they unpacked their gear, Sarah opened one of the drawers in the kitchen to store some snacks. Her hand brushed against something unexpected, a small leather-bound journal tucked away at the back of the drawer. Curious, she pulled it out and flipped through its yellowed pages. The handwriting inside was spidery and uneven, as though written hastily or under duress. "Daniel," Sarah called out, holding up the journal. "Did you know about this?" He glanced over from where he was arranging firewood near the stove. "What is it?" "It's an old journal. Looks like someone left it here." She skimmed through a few entries, her brow furrowing. "Listen to this. They watch when you sleep. The shadows move closer every night. Weird, right? And here's another one. Don't trust the whispers, they'll lead you astray." Daniel shrugged, dismissing her concerns. "Probably just some kid trying to scare people. This place has been empty for years. Who knows what kind of nonsense got left behind?" Sarah hesitated, unsure whether to believe him. Something about the words felt unsettlingly real, but she forced herself to laugh it off. "Yeah, maybe you're right. Just some stupid prank." She slid the journal back into the drawer, resolving to forget about it. But later that evening, as she lay alone in the bedroom unpacking her clothes, she began to hear faint sounds. Whispers so soft they could have been imagined. At first, she thought it might be Daniel moving around outside, but when she peeked out, the main room was empty. He was still in the great room, flipping channels on the satellite TV. "Daniel?" she called out tentatively. "Are you hearing that?" "Hearing what?" he replied, his tone distracted. "Nothing, probably." She shook her head, chiding herself for being paranoid. Still, the whispers persisted, growing slightly louder as if coming from somewhere within the walls themselves. They were indistinct, almost melodic, yet undeniably eerie. That night, after Daniel finally turned off the lights and settled into bed, the cabin grew eerily quiet. Or so it seemed at first. Within minutes, strange noises began echoing through the house. Creaking floorboards made it sound like someone, or something, was pacing in the loft above them. Distant laughter drifted in from outside, though neither of them had seen any neighbors during their drive up. And then came the footsteps, soft but deliberate, circling the perimeter of the cabin. Sarah sat upright in bed, her heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" she whispered urgently, nudging Daniel awake. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "The footsteps. Outside the door." Reluctantly, Daniel climbed out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. He cracked open the front door, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing moved except the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Satisfied, he closed the door and returned to bed. "It's just the wind," he muttered, rolling over. But Sarah wasn't convinced. As she stared out the window, she noticed shadowy figures darting between the trees. They weren't human, not entirely. Their forms flickered and shifted, dissolving into the mist whenever the moonlight hit them directly. For a moment, she thought she saw glowing eyes staring back at her, but when she blinked they vanished. Her unease deepened. Whatever those things were, they weren't natural. Later that night, Sarah tried to push aside her fears and focus on reconnecting with Daniel. They hadn't spent much quality time together lately, and this trip was supposed to be about healing the cracks in their relationship. Tentatively, she reached out to touch his arm. "Hey," she said softly. Can we talk? About us? Daniel sighed, pulling away slightly. Not tonight, Sarah. I'm exhausted. His rejection stung more than she cared to admit. You're always too tired these days, she snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. We never do anything anymore. It's like you don't even want to try. That's not fair, he shot back, sitting up now. I've been dealing with work stress, and yeah, maybe I haven't been perfect, but that doesn't mean I don't care. Well, it sure feels like it sometimes, she muttered, turning away from him. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let him see her cry. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the distant creak of the cabin settling and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Finally, Daniel broke the quiet. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't mean to shut you out. I don't know how to fix everything. Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, listening to the whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. Whether they were real or imagined, she couldn't tell. But one thing was certain. This weekend wasn't going to be the escape she'd hoped for. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight filtering through the dense canopy of trees surrounding the cabin. After breakfast, Sarah suggested they explore the woods further. She was eager to shake off the unease that had settled over her since their arrival, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Let's take a walk, she said brightly, grabbing a light jacket from the hook near the door. Maybe we'll find some deer tracks or something cool. Daniel hesitated but eventually agreed, slipping on his boots and following her outside. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. They wandered deeper into the forest, chatting idly about nothing in particular, anything to distract themselves from the growing strangeness of the cabin. After about 20 minutes, Sarah stopped abruptly, pointing toward a clearing ahead. What's that? Through the underbrush, they could see the crumbling remains of an old stone well, almost completely overtaken by vines and moss. It looked ancient, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Something about it sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, but curiosity got the better of her. I wonder if it still works, she murmured, stepping closer. As she approached, a faint sound reached her ears, a child's voice, muffled and distant, calling for help. Her heart skipped a beat. Did you hear that? She asked, turning to Daniel. Hear what? He replied, frowning. It sounded like a kid, calling for help. Without waiting for him to respond, she leaned over the edge of the well, peering into its dark depths. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Help me, it pleaded, echoing eerily. Sarah's pulse quickened. She stretched her arm out, trying to see further inside. But before she could react, icy hands shot up from the darkness, gripping her wrists with unnatural strength. A sharp tug pulled her forward, and she screamed, flailing desperately. Sarah! Daniel shouted, rushing to grab her just as she teetered dangerously close to the edge. With all his might, he yanked her back, both of them tumbling onto the ground. For a moment, they lay there, panting and staring at each other in shock. What the hell was that? Sarah gasped, clutching her chest. I don't know, Daniel admitted, his face pale. But whatever it was, it wasn't human. Neither of them dared to look back at the well as they hurried away, their footsteps crunching loudly against the forest floor. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere felt heavier than before. The cheerful warmth of the wood stove did little to dispel the chill that now lingered between them. As Sarah unpacked her gear again, she noticed small, inexplicable changes around the house. A knife she'd left on the counter earlier was gone. The curtains fluttered gently despite the windows being closed. And when she went to retrieve the journal from the drawer where she'd hidden it, she found it lying open on her pillow, as if someone or something had placed it there deliberately. Daniel, she called out, holding up the journal. Did you move this? He glanced up from the sofa, where he was flipping through channels. Move what? This. She waved the journal in the air. It was in the drawer. Now it's here. He frowned, shaking his head. Nope. Didn't touch it. She stared at him, searching for any sign of deception. You're sure? Positive, he said firmly. Why would I mess with it? I don't know, she muttered, setting the journal down. But things are moving around. Weird stuff is happening. It's probably just your imagination, he replied dismissively. You've been stressed lately. Maybe you're reading too much into things. His casual tone only fueled her frustration. My imagination? Really? You saw what happened at the well today. That wasn't my imagination. Look, he said, standing up and walking over to her. I get it, okay? This place is creepy, but jumping to conclusions isn't going to help. Let's just focus on getting through the weekend. She wanted to argue to press him further, but the weariness in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she turned away, muttering under her breath. Fine. Whatever. That night, sleep came reluctantly. Sarah tossed and turned, her mind replaying the events of the day. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and she drifted into a restless slumber. In her dream, she stood alone in the cabin, the fire crackling softly in the background. At first, everything seemed normal. The familiar creaks and groans of the old structure, the faint hum of the refrigerator. But then the shadows began to shift. They moved slowly at first, creeping along the walls and pooling in the corners. As they drew closer, Sarah realized they weren't ordinary shadows, they had shapes, forms. Faces emerged from the darkness, distorted and grotesque, whispering in voices that sent chills down her spine. He doesn't deserve you, one shadow hissed, its words cutting through the silence like a blade. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding. The figures closed in, surrounding her, their cold breath brushing against her skin. Panic surged through her as she tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, she woke with a start, bolting upright in bed. Her breathing was ragged, her body drenched in sweat. Beside her, Daniel slept peacefully, oblivious to her terror. Daniel, she whispered, shaking him gently. Wake up. He stirred groggily. What is it? I had a nightmare, she said, her voice trembling. About the shadows. They were everywhere. It's okay, he murmured, pulling her into a hug. Just a dream. Go back to sleep. But as she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching her. Over breakfast the next morning, the tension between them reached a breaking point. Sarah couldn't ignore the strange occurrences any longer. You're not telling me everything, she accused, slamming her coffee mug onto the table. Something's wrong with this place, and you know it. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I told you, it's just an old cabin. These things happen sometimes. No, they don't, she snapped. Knives don't disappear. Journals don't reappear on pillows. And people don't get dragged into wells by invisible hands. Okay, fine, he relented, his voice softening. Maybe I haven't been entirely honest. Her eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I've been distracted lately, he admitted. Work stress, personal stuff. I guess I haven't been paying attention to you the way I should. And maybe that's made me overlook things. So you're saying this is my fault? She shot back, incredulous. No, that's not what I'm saying, he replied quickly. I'm sorry, Sarah. For everything. But none of this, he gestured vaguely around the room, is real. It's tricks of the mind. Coincidences. She stared at him, torn between anger and doubt. Part of her wanted to believe him, to chalk it all up to paranoia. But another part knew deep down that something far darker was at play. That evening, after another restless day filled with strange occurrences, Sarah decided to revisit the journal. She couldn't shake the feeling that it held answers. Clues to why they were being tormented by these shadowy figures. Sitting alone at the kitchen table, she flipped through its brittle pages under the dim glow of a lantern. As she read deeper, she discovered entries written decades ago by a woman named Eleanor. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, reflecting Eleanor's descent into madness. One passage stood out. They feed on your pain, on your loneliness, on everything you try to bury deep inside yourself. At first, they seem harmless, whispers in the dark, fleeting shadows, but soon they grow bolder. They twist your thoughts, amplify your fears, until you can no longer tell what's real and what's not. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Another entry confirmed her worst suspicions. I thought I could escape my problems here, but the shadows found me anyway. They preyed on my jealousy, my anger toward him, my husband. He betrayed me, and now I see his face everywhere. In the mirrors, in the woods, even in my dreams. I don't know how much longer I can hold on before I lose myself completely. The final entry was barely legible, scrawled in jagged letters across the page. If you're reading this, leave. Now. Don't let them take you too. Sarah closed the journal, her hands trembling. It wasn't just random evil haunting them. It was something far more insidious. These shadows thrived on negative emotions, fear, anger, betrayal. And if Eleanor's experience was any indication, Sarah and Daniel were already vulnerable. Their strained relationship, the arguments, the mistrust, the unresolved issues, had created fertile ground for the shadows to exploit. Every harsh word, every moment of doubt had given them strength. Sarah realized the truth with growing dread. The shadows weren't external forces. They were manifestations of their own inner turmoil. Her guilt over pushing Daniel away, his frustration over feeling neglected, the lingering resentment between them. It all fueled the darkness closing in around them. She tried to explain this to Daniel later that night, but he dismissed her theory outright. "You're overthinking again," he said, pacing the room. "This is just some old cabin playing tricks on us." "No, it's not," she snapped, slamming the journal onto the table. "Read this. This woman, Eleanor, she went crazy because of these things. Because of what they do. They feed on our emotions, Daniel. Our pain. Our anger. And we've been giving them plenty to work with." He hesitated, glancing at the journal, but refusing to pick it up. "Even if that's true, what are we supposed to do? Stop feeling? Pretend everything's fine? We need to fix this," she insisted. "Us. Whatever's wrong between us, it's making us weaker. If we don't deal with it, they'll destroy us." For a long moment neither spoke. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Finally, Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's talk. Really talk." That night, they sat together on the sofa, opening up about everything they'd been avoiding. Daniel admitted his guilt over ignoring Sarah's needs, while Sarah confessed her fears of losing him. For the first time in months, they truly connected, not just emotionally but physically as well. But just as they began to rekindle their bond, the lights flickered violently. A deafening crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of shattering glass. They froze, staring at each other in horror. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," Daniel replied, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here." "No way," she said firmly, following him despite her racing heart. Together, they climbed the spiral staircase to the bedroom. What they found stopped them in their tracks. The room was in chaos. Furniture overturned, bedding shredded, and the walls covered in scratches. In large, jagged letters carved into the wall above the bed was one chilling word: liars. Daniel stumbled back, his face pale. "What the hell?" Sarah clutched his arm, tears streaming down her face. "We did this. We brought this on ourselves." Over the next few hours, reality began to blur for both of them. Visions plagued their minds, each more disturbing than the last. Sarah caught glimpses of herself in the mirror. Only it wasn't her. This version of her smiled cruelly, taunting her with whispers. "You'll never be enough for him. You know that, right?" Meanwhile, Daniel hallucinated seeing his ex-girlfriend, a woman who had caused immense strain in their marriage years ago. She appeared in the corners of rooms, laughing softly, and accusing him of never truly loving Sarah. "You still think about her, don't you?" Sarah accused one morning, her voice sharp with suspicion. "What? No," Daniel protested, though guilt flashed in his eyes. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" she shot back, pointing to the mirror. "Then who's that behind me?" When he turned to look, there was nothing there. But Sarah's expression told him she believed otherwise. Their mistrust deepened, driving a wedge between them once again. The shadows seemed to revel in their discord, growing stronger with every argument, every accusation. That night, the shadows finally made their move. Sarah and Daniel had barely managed to sleep after the chaos in the bedroom earlier. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder, every whisper more distinct. They sat together on the sofa, clutching flashlights like lifelines, trying to stay alert. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently before going out completely. The room plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of the dying fire in the wood stove. A cold wind swept through the cabin, though all the windows and doors were shut tight. "Did you lock everything?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes." Daniel replied, gripping the flashlight tighter. But that doesn't matter anymore. As if on cue, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breaths formed visible clouds in the air. Then came the whispers. Louder now, overlapping voices that filled the cabin with a cacophony of eerie murmurs. "They're here," Sarah gasped, clutching Daniel's arm. "They're inside." Before he could respond, the whispers turned into guttural growls. Shadowy figures began materializing around them, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke given life. One figure lunged at Sarah, its icy hands brushing against her skin. She screamed, stumbling backward as Daniel rushed to pull her away. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, dragging her toward the door. But the shadows blocked their path, forming a wall of darkness that pulsed with malevolent energy. The couple retreated to the center of the room, backs pressed together as they scanned the encroaching shapes. "This isn't working," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. "We can't fight them." "There has to be a way," Daniel muttered, his mind racing. He remembered the journal, the entries about Eleanor, and how she'd tried to resist the shadows. There had been something about a ritual. Sarah grabbed the journal from the table, flipping frantically through its pages. Her hands shook as she found the section detailing a method to banish the shadows. It involved drawing specific symbols on the floor using salt or ash, and reciting an incantation written in Latin. "We have to do this," she said, thrusting the journal at Daniel. "It's our only chance." "But what does it say?" he asked, scanning the instructions. "It says we need to draw these symbols, and then one of us has to act as bait while the other completes the ritual." Daniel froze, staring at her. "What do you mean, bait?" "The shadows will focus on whoever stays outside the circle," Sarah explained. "They'll try to drag them into the darkness." For a moment neither spoke. The weight of the decision hung heavy between them. Finally Daniel stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "You finished the ritual." "No," Sarah shot back. "I'm not letting you sacrifice yourself." "And I'm not letting you," he countered. "You're stronger than me, Sarah. You can handle this." Tears streamed down her face as she realized he was right. Reluctantly she nodded. "Okay, but promise me you'll hold on. No matter what happens, don't give up." "I won't," he promised, squeezing her hand tightly. Using ash from the wood stove, Sarah quickly drew the symbols on the floor, forming a protective circle in the center of the room. Meanwhile, Daniel stood guard, shining the flashlight at the shadows to keep them at bay. When the circle was complete, Sarah stepped inside, clutching the journal. Daniel moved to the edge of the room, bracing himself for what was to come. "Ready," she called out. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied grimly. Sarah began reciting the incantation, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The shadows reacted instantly, surging toward Daniel with terrifying speed. Cold hands clawed at him, pulling him toward the darkness. He fought back desperately, shouting encouragement to Sarah as she continued chanting. The shadows grew angrier, their growls deafening. One of them latched onto Daniel's leg, dragging him closer to the edge of the circle. He kicked wildly, managing to break free, but collapsing to the ground in exhaustion. "Keep going," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop." Sarah's voice rose above the chaos, each word resonating with power. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, pushing back against the shadows. With one final shout, she completed the incantation. A blinding light erupted from the circle, engulfing the entire cabin. The shadows shrieked in agony, dissolving into nothingness. When the light faded, the room was silent. Daniel lay sprawled on the floor, unconscious but alive. Sarah rushed to his side, cradling his head in her lap. "Daniel, can you hear me?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. His eyes fluttered open, and he gave her a weak smile. "Did it work?" She nodded, relief washing over her. "Yeah, it worked." They sat there for a long time, holding each other as the reality of what they'd endured sank in. Though the immediate danger was gone, they knew the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. After the ritual, the cabin fell eerily silent. The oppressive weight of the shadows lifted, replaced by an almost unnatural calm. Daniel collapsed onto the floor, his body racked with exhaustion from fighting off the entities. Sarah knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face as she checked to make sure he was okay. You did it, Daniel whispered hoarsely, managing a weak smile despite his fatigue. You saved us. I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah replied, her voice trembling. You held them off long enough for me to finish. For a moment, they simply sat there in silence, holding each other as the enormity of what they'd been through sank in. Though the immediate danger had passed, the experience left scars, both physical and emotional, that would take time to heal. Months later, life returned to some semblance of normalcy. Back home, Sarah and Daniel reflected on their harrowing weekend in the woods during quiet moments together. They decided not to return to the cabin, not because they were afraid, but because the memories were too raw. Instead, they focused on rebuilding their relationship, determined to address the issues that had made them vulnerable in the first place. One evening, while sitting by the fireplace, Sarah brought up the journal. Do you ever think about Eleanor? She asked softly. All the time, Daniel admitted. What happened to her? It makes me realize how important it is to face our problems head on. We can't let resentment or fear fester like that. Sarah nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. I'm glad we got through it. Together. Though they still had challenges ahead, they felt stronger than ever. A testament to the bond they'd forged in the face of unimaginable terror. In the final scene, Sarah donates the journal to a local museum, hoping others might learn from its cryptic warnings. As she walks away, the camera pans back to reveal faint shadows creeping along the edges of the display case. A whisper echoes softly. They're always watching. The screen cuts to black, leaving viewers with a lingering sense of unease.